lesson today from the letter to the Hebrews is the conclusion of one of the greatest chapters in all of the scriptures. The chapter begins, before our lesson does today, with the words, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. From there, the chapter continues to list many of the people in the Hebrew scriptures who lived remarkable lives of faith. From Abel, who pleased God with his sacrifice, to Noah, who pleased God with his belief that the flood was coming even when people in the world were laughing at him. Noah, who set out for a place without knowing where he was going, but trusting the one who was going to lead him there. The letter says that Noah looked forward to a city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. The letter to the Hebrews speaks of Abraham, whose faith was accounted as righteousness, even though he was 100 years old. As the letter sort of bluntly puts it, Abraham was as good as dead. That's what the letter says. It's real blunt, the scripture's blunt. Even though he was as good as dead, he became the father of a great nation. And then he speaks of the faith of Moses, who refused to be called a son of the Pharaoh's daughter in order to remain a faithful child of Abraham instead. And then our lesson begins with the faith of the people who crossed the Red Sea to safety, to the fact that faith is what caused the fortified earthen walls of Jericho to collapse. The faith of Rahab, the harlot who believed in the men whom God sent to her and protected them from the king of Jericho, thereby showing her faith in the God of Israel. And then the letter goes on to mention Gideon. I always think of Alex when I think of Gideon, because Gideon was just a small fry. He was hiding his little bit of grain that he had managed to save on the threshing floor, scared to death of the soldiers who might put him to death. And God turns this little squirt of Gideon into a great military hero who pulls down the altars of Baal, destroys the pagan temple, cuts down the sacred pole, and eventually launches a surprise attack. And this little kid routs the entire army of the Midianites with only 300 troops led by a kid. Isn't that great? What a great story that is. The letter mentions the great warrior Barak, who defeated Sisera at Mount Tabor, and Jael, the wife of Heber, who pounds a tent peg through Sisera's head. Girl power, you get girl power even in the Old Testament. It mentions Samson, who slew 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey and single-handedly pulled down their temple to their pagan god Dagon. It mentions Jephthah, who defeated the Ammonites. It mentions all of the prophets and their suffering in order to proclaim the word of the Lord. And then it summarizes all of these remembrances with the most wonderful quote of all. Therefore, it says, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and run with perseverance the race that is set before us. The word for witness in Greek is martyrion, like the martyrs of the church. The witness, the people who lay down their lives in witness of their faith. This has gotten me to think about all the great clouds of witnesses in my lifetime. The people who have been instrumental in showing me faith during my lifetime, who taught me what it means to believe in the assurance of things that we hope for and be convinced of the truth of our faith even though we cannot see it. These are my cloud of witnesses. Each one of you brings inside you your own cloud of witnesses, the people who showed you in your lifetime what faith means. I remember my friend and mentor, Bishop Frank Vest, who I knew while he was a rector at Christ Church across the street from where I lived, while I was in college, law school, and the 9 years that I practiced law in Charlotte. At that time, Christ Church was busting at the seams. It was growing by leaps and bounds, and the building really couldn't hold all the people. It really needed some additional space. The existing parish hall, which is now called the Blue Room, was far too small for the Sunday school class of adults, much less larger events that took place in the church. So the people in the church were just waiting to build a capital campaign, waiting to build more space, a new parish hall, some classrooms, because they were just bursting at the seams. Well, although Frank was all for it, he took note of what a wealthy church Christ Church was and how many people in Charlotte lived in poverty and need. So instead of starting a building fund, Frank convinced the vestry to begin an outreach fund first. And so instead of a building fund, the first funds raised were to be given to the poor. And then, after they cared for the poor, then he would let them raise money for themselves. Wasn't that sneaky? It was manipulative and kind of sneaky and kind of mean, but you know what? It worked. It was a gutsy thing to do, even in a very wealthy church. But Frank had not only faith in God, but in the people of Christ Church to do the right thing by helping those in need before they helped themselves. That's what Frank taught me. The next person in my cloud of witnesses was a woman, Henrietta McKenzie. She was of retirement age back when I was in my 30s. I met her in 1988 at St. Mary's in High Point. Anyhow, one evening, Henrietta showed up at a vestry meeting, and she explained to the vestry about Habitat for Humanity. And she told the vestry that St. Mary's was going to be the first church in High Point to build a Habitat house themselves. They weren't going to call on anybody else in the community. The church was going to build a Habitat house. Well, the vestry was too smart to ever argue with Henrietta McKenzie, for she was a force of nature. She had built several houses herself for her family and for her sons when they grew up, and she was practically a contractor from her personal experience in building houses. Anyhow, Henrietta found a member of the church who donated the lot for the Habitat house. She knew the people who could help fund the materials. She lined up all the volunteers to build it. She worked with the Habitat organization to get approval for the family that was going to live in it. And the house under Henrietta was built on time and under budget because that was Henrietta. She worked and it happened. She was a force of nature and a force for good. The third person I think of in my cloud of witnesses was Julia Ann Campbell, who died not too long after I came to Emmanuel Church in Franklin in 1991. Julia Ann knew what sacrifice meant. She had taken care of her husband, Robert, through a long number of years, suffering with Alzheimer's disease. And caring for him took its toll on her. Those 36-hour days required their payment. As she was dying with congestive heart failure in the hospital, she told me that from the beginning, she knew that taking care of him would cost her her life. She said she made that decision knowingly and that she would not have done it any other way. As Jesus says, no one has greater love than to lay down their life for their friends and family. And Julianne did. The fourth and fifth people in my cloud of witnesses were Mac and Iva Siemens. Mac and Iva had been childhood sweethearts, but then they went off to separate colleges, and they went their own ways, and they married other people, and eventually each of their spouses died. And Mac and Iva bumped into each other, and their love was rekindled all those years later. Mac had a bad ticker, and he was told that he could pop off at any minute, and they both knew it when they're married. Iva, on the other hand, had diabetes, and by the time I knew her, she was blind from diabetic retinopathy, and Mac's heart was failing. I went to see Mac and Iva in the hospital, and they both looked at me and they said, "We decided that when we were married, we would celebrate every day that we had together, because we had a lot of days that weren't together. And so we would celebrate every one we had. And we are thankful for every single one of those days. And we decided a long time ago to never put a question mark where God has put a period." Wow. Thus, Mac and Iva accepted what was happening to them with grace and dignity and faith and thanksgiving for what they had had. And they earned their place in my great cloud of witnesses. There are lots of other people in the great cloud of witnesses for me that has surrounded me over the years, and I can't bring myself to speak about them out of fear that I might embarrass them or their families. I can only talk about the ones who are gone, because the ones who are here would be too embarrassed if I talked about them. So I want to end with the last verse of our lesson and the following verse to encourage us all in our earthly pilgrimage, even when the world around us seems to be so discouraging these days. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. St. Paul's has quite a journey ahead of it, a journey of challenges and a journey of triumphs, and the people of St. Paul's will make this journey surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses in each one of your lives. You got your own cloud. And I have learned in my short time here, a few of those cloud of witnesses are in this church. And St. Paul's is now and always be the little parish that could, like the little engine that could. And I will make this journey into the future a tiny bit longer with you guys, but you will make it with your new rector eventually, whenever they get here, whenever that happens, surrounded by the witnesses, both living and dead, embraced by their love and supported by their prayers. And the thing I want to assure you is that God is hard at work planning the future of St. Paul's, already planting the seeds for the future in people's hearts. And it's the job of the search committee and the vestry, and indeed my job, just to stay out of God's way and not do anything to get in the way of God's plan. And God knows the challenges that St. Paul's faces, the limited resources among other things. The reality is that St. Paul's will be hiring a full-time rector without the permanent funding in place to pay for it in the long run. There are a few years worth of money in the bank, but that's about it. But St. Paul's also sits in a wonderful demographic place for future growth. Fort Mill is growing like a weed, and we sit here in the middle of cranes building larger and larger intersections in the interstate. They're building that crazy intersection out there that I can't figure out how it's going to work yet, you know? Big bridges that seem to be going nowhere. Yeah, but, you know, we've got to have faith that they will eventually connect. Yeah. And we're counting on a future that's full of promise and hope. As T.S. Eliot wrote in his poem, Little Gidding, we shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know that place for the first time. At the end of St. Paul's great journey, when it arrives, it will be back where it started, a prosperous community full of sound industry and pure manners, full of intelligent and gentle women and men, a reconciled community of goodwill toward all people. And it will know that place as it has never known it before for the first time. And all of the great cloud of witnesses who have surrounded us in our lifetimes will journey with us in our hearts and bring us safely home, renewed, reinvigorated, restored, and ready to embrace the future. Amen.